am so glad to be here with you this morning. Some of my very dear friends who are colleagues of mine have also recently been here, and they came back to Abilene singing your praises and informing me of what a wonderful church you are. And so I am delighted to be here. As was mentioned, I am a professor at ACU, and this is the time in the semester where I start to get the most entertaining emails from my students, and it is because they are exhausted. They have been spending their time pledging fraternities and sororities, and of course, this coincides also with midterm exams, and so they're stretched too thin, they're behind in their work. And add to this, if you know anything about ACU, then you might know that we are currently in what we call sing-song season. And sing-song is a big musical performance that's put on by our students. As an outsider coming into ACU, I found it very strange. I can really only describe it as weirdly competitive and utterly inscrutable to outsiders. But my students are spent. They are at the end of their ropes. And this is when I start to get the desperate emails. Emails like, hello, Dr. Martin Shelby, which is not my name, but it's, they're emailing me at 2 a.m. I seem to have come down with the flu and I will not make it to class. Will I miss anything? Are we doing anything? To which I always want to respond sarcastically, well, no. Well, if you can't be there, then no, of course we won't do anything for the hour and 20 minutes that you're missing. Of course not, you won't miss anything. But no, in fact, somebody asked me after first service, they said, do you ever just respond, yes? Yeah, I do. Sometimes I get the ambiguous email, Dr. McLaughlin Shesby, I'm afraid I can't come to class today. No further explanation, sometimes I find my students are losing a shocking number of extended relatives during this season, like second cousins, great aunts. And let me be clear, I always treat my students with kindness and respect. I give them the benefit of the doubt. I always lead with belief. But between you and me, in this particular season, I do wonder, did they really lose their second cousin's great aunt? Did they really catch the flu? Has there really been an emergency? Because I just saw that same student throwing down a cheeseburger and a margarita at Chili's 2 hours after class let out. So I have my doubts. But what I also know to be true about my students is that right now they're in a season of life where they are trying to figure out, can I be honest? They want to know, can I be honest? If they are not at their best, what will happen if I, their professor, know the truth? They want to know, is it better to hide for the sake of our relationship? Well, I can sympathize with those kinds of questions, and I bet you can too. The text for today's sermon comes from John chapter 4. This is the story of the Samaritan woman at the well, a woman who has a shadowy past, and she encounters Jesus, and everything changes. Now, our story begins like this. Jesus is tired. This is where the story begins. Not with divine spectacle, not with a sign, but with fatigue. He sits down by Jacob's well in the middle of the day while his disciples go off to find groceries. The Gospel of John, which so often lifts our eyes to these poetic, lofty, kind of cosmic descriptions of Christ, like the Logos, the light, the life, the way, begins this scene grounding us firmly in Jesus' humanity, his relatability. He's thirsty, he's weary, and he's waiting. And it is from this very ordinary description of Jesus' humanity that one of the most theologically deep and expansive encounters of the entire gospel takes place. The text tells us that a Samaritan woman comes to draw water. She comes alone at noon, when the sun is unforgiving and the work is much harder, which should automatically make us wonder, what's she doing? Why is she here? Why at this time? Why didn't she come earlier in the morning when other women would have been retrieving their water in the cool of the day? Why has she come later in the day when it's harder and hotter? And further, why would she risk coming out to this relatively remote place all alone? Now, the text does not tell us why. Well, not entirely. It does not explain her whole situation. And honestly, I think the gospel's restraint here it really matters. See, we are going to be tempted to make assumptions about her. The more we get to know about her story, we, like the townspeople, will have our preconceptions of her life. But as we will see, the text doesn't really indulge us. It fails to satisfy our curiosity or our desire for a scapegoat or a diversion. We won't get to judge her for the things we learn about her life. In fact, the challenge for us will be, can we suspend our judgments so that we can accept the invitation that she offers us at the end of the story? So Jesus speaks to her. "Give me a drink," he says somewhat abruptly. And with that request, the story immediately becomes socially and religiously charged. Here is a man in this ancient context speaking publicly and directly to a woman. Scandal in that day and age. And then add to the fact that this is a Jewish man speaking with a Samaritan woman. Now, you might be aware of the deep animosity that presides over Jewish and Samaritan social customs. They do not like each other. They do not talk to each other. They avoid each other at all costs. And why? Well, it's complicated, as these things tend to be. But if you will permit me a brief history lesson, and I do mean brief, the Samaritans emerged as a distinct ethno-religious group sometime after the Great Jewish Diaspora, which began with the Assyrians conquering northern Israel in the year 722 BCE. The Samaritans do share common ancestry with the Jews. They also claim being descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And they also hold Torah as scripture. Those first 5 books of the Old Testament, Jews also hold as scripture. But they diverge on just a few things. And they are also looking for a Messiah, but the thing is, when they imagine one who will restore everything, well, the Jews believe that the Messiah is going to restore their people, and that the locus of that restoration will happen in Jerusalem. Their true worship takes place at the temple in Jerusalem, but the Samaritans believe that true worship ought to take place at the temple on Mount Gerizim, and that restoration will come for their people. And this core distinction, coupled with a history of prejudice and violence between the groups, has culminated in a situation where it would actually be better for a person to take the long way home than to have to cross through the territory of the other group. But here's Jesus, a Jew who has just traveled through Samaritan country, and now he sits at Jacob's well with a Samaritan woman, and he is determined to talk with her. Not only does he talk with her, he actually makes himself fairly vulnerable to her. I mean, he is thirsty. He has asked her for a drink. He is humbling himself with her. He invites her to be his host. He throws himself on her hospitality, and in doing so, he crosses all kinds of lines that have been meticulously drawn and fiercely guarded. But the woman is smart. If there's one thing that we can surmise about this woman from the text, she is quick as a whip. And she is not really entertained by Jesus' cavalier treatment of their social boundaries. So she names the transgression outright. She says, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a Samaritan woman?" Which is kind of like saying, "Who do you think you are? Like, what is your game?" And what follows from Jesus is not a sermon or a rebuttal, but a conversation, an extended encounter. Jesus begins to speak to her about living water that does not merely meet daily need, but water that gives life abundant, water that will never run dry. This woman, she has known what it is to thirst, to suffer, to long for stability, to fight for survival. So she's leaning in, she's listening. She asks Jesus to give her this living water, which prompts Jesus to shift the conversation in an unexpected and rather uncomfortable direction, her personal life. And if you know the story, this is the part where Jesus says, "Go call your husband and come back." And to her credit, she's not really dishonest when she says that she doesn't technically have a husband right now, you know. Of course, she's not banking on Jesus already knowing the whole story of her life. And it turns out, as Jesus says out loud to her, that indeed she does not have a husband right now. She has had 5 husbands, and the man that she currently lives with is not her husband. Now, again, we don't know the whole story. We're tempted to fill in the gaps, but we don't know what has led to this situation. She could have been widowed several times. She could have been abandoned. Maybe what started off as a seemingly safe situation spiraled out into a cycle of abuse and neglect. We do not know. Could her own sin and indiscretion had led to the loss of all those marriages? Well, sure. But the point is, the text does not tell us. The text doesn't make gossips of us. We simply don't get to know. All we can know for certain is that this woman has led an incredibly difficult life, a very painful life, a life fraught with misunderstanding and isolation, one marked by yearning and fear, and a thirst for something more, something lasting. And when the spotlight in the conversation is pointed right at her uncomfortable past, Jesus does something remarkable. He doesn't flinch. He does not seek to expose her or manipulate her. He does not wield the truth as a weapon. He does not reduce her to her past. He does not shame her. He merely lets her know, I see you. I know what happened. I know what brought you to this point in your life. And my offer remains on the table. Living water, life abundant, the hope for something better. Now, some of you might have seen a headline recently that the very famous actor Robert Duvall passed away about a week ago. He was in his 90s, a prolific actor, and I was actually in San Diego for a preacher's conference, a preacher's gathering, when I saw that headline. And the person who was directing that particular gathering of ministers, his name is Mike Cope, and he sent out a text to a group of us that said, "Go easy on me this morning, my favorite actor just died." So that day when we got together for lunch, we all began to talk about our favorite Robert Duvall movies. And I quickly realized that my favorite Robert Duvall movie is actually kind of a dark horse. Not very many people had seen it before. It came out in 2009, and it was a movie called Get Low. And in this movie, Duvall plays Felix Bush. He is a cantankerous old hermit who wants nothing to do with the people in his town. It's a small town in Tennessee in the 1930s. Now, everyone in town is afraid of Felix. Everyone's afraid of him. They grew up circulating rumors about him as children, and now they're adults and they're still sharing the rumors, right? They're scared of the man who's lived on the edge of town for all these decades, and they've got stories like, was he a fugitive? Well, I heard he murdered somebody. I hear he's got bodies in the backyard. You know, the lore rolls deep. And so everybody's really surprised one day when Felix shows up to town. And Felix comes into town, and he grabs the reverend, and he finds a very enterprising funeral director played by Bill Murray. And he sits them down, and he says, I think it's about time for me to get low, which is slang for get buried. He knows he's getting old, and he thinks it's time to start planning his funeral. But here's the catch. There's a little bit of a twist here. He wants to be there for his own funeral, like alive. And so he starts to call it a funeral party, and he says the whole town is invited. And so, at first the reverend is kind of scratching his head. Is this theologically sound? I don't know, but the enterprising funeral director says, no, I think we can work with this, sir. Put that money right there. And so then they begin to market it. They put flyers all over the town. They go on the radio, and the town is buzzing with the news of the funeral party. But the thing is, if you're going to come to the funeral party, you have to be willing to tell a story that you heard about Felix. One of the rumors, with him there. One of the guys says, what do you think's going to happen? He said, well, I think we might get shot. They're all scared of him. And so the funeral party happens. It's out in a big field, and they've got concessions and balloons, and there's this big stage, a big platform with a single microphone, and sure enough, one by one, people start getting up and telling the rumors that they heard growing up about Felix. But the last person to talk is Felix himself. And Felix, for the first time ever, tells everybody the truth about his life, a truth that none of them had known before. And the truth of his life is that he has lived with debilitating shame and guilt for decades over something that he did. Nobody knew about what he had done. Nobody knew the truth about it. But that shame and that guilt had driven him to self-isolate, and he thought of it as like paying penance, making atonement for what he had done by depriving himself of relationships all those years. But as he got to the end of his life, he realized he could not die at peace without telling the truth. And as the movie progresses, he also begins to realize that maybe it would have been worth it to let people in. Maybe it would have been worth it to let his story come to light, because maybe relationships are forged that way. I think about that movie every time I read the story about the Samaritan woman. This story in John chapter 4 is really long. It's 42 verses long, and it's a lot of meandering theological discourse, as tends to happen in the Gospel of John. But I think that this is the theological crux of the story. Too often we assume that being fully known would be a threat to our belonging. That if everything were visible, our losses, our regrets, our compromised hopes, we would be diminished. But here, in this story, it turns out knowledge is not the opposite of grace, and it's not an impediment to deeper connection. Rather, knowledge is the precondition of it. Her life's story, buried in secretive shadows, her shame managed carefully through social avoidance. When it all gets brought up to the surface, when she and Jesus are able to look at it clearly together, everything changes. And rather than becoming defensive or dismissive, she just gets really curious about Jesus. She's very surprised that he was miraculously able to tell her about her life. So she says, "Sir, I see that you are a prophet." And then she asks a question that has shaped her people's identity for generations. She asks the question, where is God rightly worshiped? On this mountain, Mount Gerizim, or in Jerusalem? Now, it might seem like this is a deflection, like an attempt to get away from her personal life in the conversation, but it's actually a serious question, and it's quite personal, too. It's born from a history of contested belonging. It is a question about who are God's people? Who is God restoring? And will she get to be a part of that story? Now, for context, It may be worth noting that the Samaritan temple that she's talking about, Mount Gerizim, had been destroyed about 140 years prior to that conversation and had not been rebuilt yet. And so it's totally plausible that the ruins of that temple could even be visible from where they sat and had that conversation. To add another layer of context, it's also very likely that by the time the Gospel of John was written, the Jewish temple in Jerusalem had also been destroyed, because that temple was destroyed in the year 70 CE, and we think that John was probably written between 85 and 100. And so this is a highly charged topic for everybody. And we may be a little bit removed from this, right? Like, why is the temple such a big deal? Well, for both the Jews and the Samaritans, the temple represents the very presence of God in their midst. The temple represents God's activity among them, that the same God who rescued their ancestors is going to come through for them as well. And now with these temples in ruins, people are wondering, is God with us? Is God restoring us? What is this going to look like? So Jesus' answer about the temple defies everything that she had assumed about him. Regarding whether they should worship in Gerizim or Jerusalem, Jesus answers, neither. Neither this mountain nor Jerusalem. And in that moment, centuries of religious geography are completely undone. Jesus does not adjudicate between rival claims. He reframes the entire question. Worship is being relocated, not to a new sacred site, but to a new way of being in relationship with God. God is spirit, he says. And those who worship must worship in spirit and in truth. And while it might sound abstract, this is a radical reframing. It's a reorientation. Worship is no longer tethered to control or proximity or inherited power. It is no longer about defending the right place or the right people. It is about being gathered around the presence of God being made known through the person Jesus. And as we will see by the end of the story, neither Samaritans or Jesus' Jewish followers will get to maintain their previous fidelities. Everyone is invited to move. Now, after this, the woman has become even more curious. As I mentioned before, the Samaritans also were hopeful that there would be a messianic figure who would reveal all things and restore all things. And as she heard Jesus talking, she started to think about that Messiah. Her heart is yearning to know what Jesus might know about that Messiah. So when she asks, Jesus responds, surprisingly, I am he. In Greek, the words ego eimi, literally, I am. I am, as in the I am from the burning bush that talked to Moses, the I am of their ancestors. I am the one that you are waiting for. I am the one that your question reaches toward. I am the one who will reveal all things and make all things new. And it's at this moment that the conversation is interrupted because the disciples have returned from getting their groceries. And the text pauses just long enough for us to see their reaction. And they are disturbed. They are disturbed to see Jesus talking with this Samaritan woman. And the text says that they don't say it out loud, but internally they are scandalized. This is not how they imagined the work of God unfolding. This woman, this place, this conversation wasn't on their bingo card, right? They were not expecting it. It's in moments like these that I like to remind my students, Jesus does not have a PR guy, you know? Like, this much is evident. He's not got, like, somebody running alongside him warning him about the optics of the situation. No, he has rightly made everyone very uncomfortable. But rather than giving the disciples a platform to spew their prejudice or judgments, the Gospel of John just kind of pivots and follows the woman for a moment as she leaves her jar behind at the well and runs right back into the town, the city that she likely avoided, the city that she came alone out of in the middle of the day. she goes right back to that city and she begins to speak to them. And she says, "Come and see. Come and see a man who told me everything I have ever done. Could he be the Messiah?" This is the turning point of the narrative. The woman who came to avoid others now seeks them out. The woman who carried the weight of her life quietly now speaks publicly. The woman whose story might have been used against her has now become the first evangelist in the Gospel of John and the first evangelist to the Samaritans. And notice what her testimony does not do. Well, she doesn't defend herself. She doesn't offer up excuses or justifications. She doesn't resolve theological debates. She does not claim certainty. Rather, she just invites for their encounter, for them to come and see. Something profound has happened for her. She has been known and not destroyed by that knowledge. She has been addressed, and in being addressed, she has been restored. The very source of her greatest shame has now become the catalyst of her testimony. Come and see. And they do. They come and see, and they listen. And then they even invite Jesus to stay with them for a while. And eventually they come back to the woman and they tell her, "It is no longer just because of what you have said that we believe, for we have heard it ourselves." Now, it's important to note that this story is not just about the Samaritans. It's also about the disciples, who must learn that God's mission will unsettle their expectations about who is in and who is out, who is worthy and who is not. As surely as the Samaritans will have to move away from their boundaries and their prejudices and their prior fidelities, so too will Jesus' Jewish followers. Nobody gets to hold on to their hate any longer. Jesus is radically transforming the social, political, religious landscape. So maybe it is here that we can begin to see that this text is also about us. Right now in our society, deep divisions thrive on the hot take, the snap judgment, the preconceived notions. Rage is the currency of our politics, and prejudice is its supplier. It is convenient to imagine that maybe our enemies are deserving of our animosity. It is easy to treat them not as fellow humans, but as the worst of sinners. And then meanwhile, oftentimes, our own standing in our own communities depends on our capacity to perfectly align with our communities. So if you disagree politically on something, or if you have a secret that might undo you, or even if you just feel like you have to be less known in order to be loved, well, we're playing the same game as the Samaritan woman now. And it's exhausting. It's a dead end. And it will leave us perpetually thirsty. But what happens when we discover that being fully known by Christ is not the end of our usefulness or the end of our belonging, but it's actually the beginning of our calling in community? What happens when we decide that we want to follow Christ into deeper understanding of the people we thought were our enemies? How does this encounter with Jesus relocate all of us? The woman's invitation still stands. Come and see. Not as pressure, not as proof, but as testimony. Come and see. Come and see the one who knows your story and does not turn away. Come and see the one who meets us not at our best, but at the well in the heat of the day. Come and see the one who restores not by erasing our lives, but by redeeming them. Come and see, and you will be seen. And in that seeing, we are reoriented. In that seeing, a deeper worship is made possible. In that seeing, our walls come down and our conceptions of God are mightily expanded. So may we be willing to be moved, to be reoriented, to come and see all things new. Please pray with me. Gracious God, We thank you for being the God who sees, the God who knows our stories. God, we thank you for being a God who draws us closer to you, who does not flinch at the sight of our wounds or our baggage, but welcomes us into your fold. God, we ask that you would give us eyes to see others clearly, that we would come to see others the way that you see them. Bring down our pride, tear down our walls, and make us more like you. In Jesus' name, amen.